staying truly informed without feeling, completely swamped by information, that's the challenge, isn't it?
It really is. There's just so much out there.
And that's exactly what we're tackling here on the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into a recent Dutch radio program transcript. We're pulling out the crucial insights.
Yeah, discussions on everything from Dutch politics, the Gaza conflict, even a big parliamentary inquiry.
Right. Our goal: to give you the essential knowledge, maybe even a few surprises, and, well, basically a shortcut to understanding these important, often complex issues. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, what's immediately striking is how this single discussion, weaves together so many different but connected threads in their current political landscape.
Absolutely. The first thing that really stood out was the news of Jan Terlouw's passing.
Yeah.
When a figure with his kind of impact leaves us, it's always a moment to reflect. For many, especially in, let's say, progressive circles in the Netherlands, he was this Nuffalopa, that beloved cuddle grandpa figure.
Largely thanks to his children's books. Right? Wonderful books.
Exactly.
But Terlouw's passing, it really underscores a shift in Dutch society, too. That story about leaving front doors open in Utrecht, back when his family was young.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
It just resonates so strongly. It speaks to a level of societal trust that feels almost, well, like a relic today, doesn't it?
It really does.
And it also hints, subtly, at how much the role of women has changed since then.
Yeah, that too. And apparently his very first speech in the Dutch parliament's lower house was about this very thing, societal trust.
Quite a way to start a political career.
It is. Although it was interesting, Marian Manisma noted that climate change wasn't really a central focus for him back then.
Right.
Thinking about his political style. It seemed gentler, maybe more consensus-driven. Do you think that approach would even work today?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Especially when you compare it to the much more direct, often confrontational style we see now, particularly from someone like Geert Wilders. It's very direct. It raises that critical question about how political talk evolves. I mean, a moderate approach might seem out of sync now, sure.
Right.
But you could also argue, maybe, that someone seen as genuinely sincere outside the immediate fight might actually cut through the noise.
Possibly.
But in the current Dutch parliament, facing someone like Wilders, there's a real risk that gentleness could just be seen as, well, weakness.
That's a sharp point. But we also can't forget Terlouw's big role in building D66, the Social Liberal Party, into a major force after Hans van Mierlo.
Absolutely critical role.
And crucially, his work in making climate change a key issue for them. It kind of makes you think about Nicolien van Vroonhoven now with NSC.
The parallel.
Yeah, trying to carve out her own space after Peter Omtzigt, who, like Van Mierlo, has such a strong individual presence. It's a tough legacy to build on.
It really is.
Terlouw's passing really highlights that potential decline in trust, a theme from his early days, contrasted with today's, well, more polarized scene. And it's interesting, this pattern you see in parties when a dominant founder moves on, it tests the party's real strength. Is it about ideas or just one person?
Yeah.
Terlouw managed that transition for D66. That's the challenge Van Vroonhoven faces now.
Okay, so let's pivot to something else that was pretty unexpected. He's Berghuis.
Yes. The spin doctor.
The VVD's head of communications, definitely seen as a spin doctor, becoming the head of WNL, a Dutch broadcaster. That certainly made some people do a double take.
It did. Berghuis's move really underscores how those lines between political spin and, journalistic independence can blur.
Definitely.
It maybe pushes the Dutch media landscape a bit towards a more partisan model.
That's the concern. Berghuis has this reputation in The Hague, sharp, strategic.
And ruthless. Some say ruthless.
Right. The comparison to Jacques de Vries at the CDA really highlights the influence these behind-the-scenes figures can have.
Oh, absolutely. They're not just spokespeople. They often shape the whole strategy, the messaging.
Exactly. And this move to WNL is particularly interesting because of Berghuis's time there.
Right, the former boss.
There were those reports, remember, from former WNL employees saying he steered things towards VVD views, maybe even took out critical questions for VVD guests.
Yeah, I recall those reports. So Berghuis, with his deep VVD ties, taking over now. It certainly raises questions about potential bias, doesn't it?
It does. It brings up that fundamental question about journalistic integrity.
And conflicts of interest. How does a news organization stay credible reporting on past politics if its leader was, so deeply involved with one party?
It's a big journalistic dilemma.
It is. The comparison to Dan Bonenkamp, former D66 spin doctor, now to Bantia, a regional paper. It's interesting, but WNL's national focus makes this feel bigger.
Amplifies the concerns, yeah. And there's this wider worry about the Dutch media maybe drifting towards that American model.
Where outlets cater to specific political views.
Exactly. The transcript mentions some shows struggle to get VVD guests, while coalition leaders pop up often on places like Nieuws Vandaag.
That kind of trend could really deepen polarization.
For sure.
Though, looking at the bigger picture, the worry isn't just about an outlet leaning one way. WNL is seen as right-leaning anyway.
Right.
The real question is, will a former spin doctor in charge actually encourage critical journalism, even towards his old allies? Or does it become more of a partisan platform?
Good point.
The comparison to the Telegraph newspaper, potentially being critical even of right-wing figures who stray, that offers maybe a sliver of hope for nuance? Maybe.
Maybe. Okay, let's shift gears now to some policy challenges. Mona Kaiser seems to be facing some real headaches with housing corporations.
Ah, yes, the rent freeze issue.
It seems a key promise from Geert Wilders freezing social housing rents for 2 years is causing quite a stir.
Yeah, this really illustrates that classic disconnect between political promises made, high up, and the messy reality of putting policy into practice, often with consequences you didn't expect.
Absolutely.
What's clear here is the clash. You've got this political deal from coalition talks hitting up against existing agreements and practicalities. Kaiser had apparently just sealed a deal with housing corporations for sustainability work, construction, things that included small rent increases.
Okay.
So this freeze just throws a huge wrench in those plans. The corporations feel the government's unreliable. They're even talking legal action.
Wow, and it gets even trickier, doesn't it? Apparently about 500,000 tenants in private social housing got overlooked.
Exactly, 500,000. They fall under the social rent rules, but they're not in the government databases. So implementing the freeze for them is incredibly difficult.
That just highlights the risk of making these big decisions behind closed doors without fully grasping the practical side.
Totally. You end up with this tough choice. Either an unfair system, some tenants get the freeze, others don't, or a really expensive, maybe ineffective attempt to fix it afterwards.
And the fact that Wilders and Jazilgas apparently didn't account for this huge group, well, it shows how easy it is to miss things in those negotiations.
It really does.
And the consequences go way beyond tenants, right? The housing corporations might borrow less now.
Which hits related industries, sustainability, construction.
It shows how interconnected it all is.
Exactly. These policy decisions don't exist in a bubble. They ripple out.
Okay, now let's touch on Minister Faber and those controversial comments about asylum seeker places.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
That caused a bit of a stir.
She had to apologize for getting it wrong about Wassenaar, the wealthy town, not having an asylum center. Turns out there is one, seasonally, at Duinrell Park.
Right, the clarification.
But it was her wider comments that really sparked the debate, saying reception centers are not holiday resorts.
And wanting to cut back on outings for asylum seekers, arguing who pays determines.
That phrase, who pays determines, it feels like a really narrow view of things, doesn't it? Faber's rhetoric really exposes a tension, I think, between a cost-focused view of welfare and, well, fundamental rights. It's a potentially worrying trend.
It's striking, the rhetoric she used and the assumptions behind it, that who pays determines line. It's a really limited, maybe problematic take on democracy and the rule of law.
Definitely.
As the discussion pointed out, if you apply that logic everywhere, think about healthcare access or international relations, it gets concerning fast.
A very narrow lens for rights and responsibilities. And it seems her views are pretty out of sync with her own implementing organization, COA.
Which is an independent administrative body, remember, semi-autonomous.
Right. And COA has publicly said the dispersal law is still needed.
This disconnect suggests that Faber's stance, especially focusing on symbolic stuff like outings, might be, well, maybe a deliberate strategy.
To distract from bigger budget issues.
Possibly. COA is facing serious funding cuts, even though the need for accommodation is still high.
And the irony is, the opposition to that dispersal law, the one meant to spread asylum seekers out more evenly,
Leads to a shortage of regular centers.
exactly, which forces the government into using more expensive emergency options like hotels and cruise ships.
Which benefits private companies, ultimately.
Right.
And it's important to remember COA, as that independent body with a legal mandate, has some autonomy. The minister can't just dictate every operational detail, like outings.
Makes sense.
The growing weariness you hear from MPs, even within the coalition, about these repeating controversies.
Yeah.
It shows how politically sensitive this all is.
It certainly does. And the public is clearly interested. Those articles get high readership. It just highlights the different viewpoints and the tough spot parties are in trying to respond effectively.
Absolutely. Navigating these charged issues needs a careful balance, addressing public concerns while upholding laws and principles.
Let's turn our attention now to a major international development, the worsening situation in Gaza during the parliamentary recess.
Yeah, the reports of famine, food blockades, deeply concerning.
And the Dutch political reaction, or maybe the caution in it compared to some other countries,
Yeah.
it's been quite noticeable. It really feels like the Dutch government's careful Gaza response shows the constraints of coalition politics, especially with the PVV involved.
What's immediately striking is the hesitant, almost, well, the transcript called it stammering, response from Prime Minister Schoof.
Yeah, when asked about the situation and Israeli actions.
His reluctance to condemn clearly really contrasts with, say, the Belgian Prime Minister De Wever's firm stance.
Definitely.
Those excerpts really show it. Schoof using Zorgelijk repeatedly, his almost apologetic tone about civilian deaths. It suggests a leader working under real constraints.
He sounded like he was walking on eggshells, didn't he? And it's hard not to see the politics leading a coalition with the strongly pro-Israel PVV as a huge factor.
It has to be. However, it is interesting to see a subtle shift from other coalition partners, like VVD's Vanderberg, even Jazilgis, starting to voice concerns about how the war is being fought.
Right, even while still backing Israel's right to exist.
It suggests a growing unease across the wider Dutch political scene about Gaza, even in parties traditionally supportive of Israel.
And you even had stronger criticism from Ertmans of J21, a right-leaning party.
Saying Israel has vergalopeerd, overreached, and condemning talk of displacing Gazans, that further highlights this shifting view.
It really underscores how important the language politicians use is. It signals the Netherlands' stance internationally, even if direct action is limited.
Absolutely.
And the contrast between Schoof's hesitation and Wilder's unwavering pro-Israel position is pretty stark.
Very stark. In international relations, even carefully chosen words carry a lot of weight. They signal shifts on complex, sensitive issues.
Okay, on a more concrete level, Foreign Affairs Minister Henk Bruinslot took quite a step.
The letter to Borrell, yeah.
Writing to the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, expressing serious concerns about the food blockade in Gaza, and proposing an investigation into potential human rights violations under the EU-Israel Association Agreement.
That agreement's key for trade and cooperation.
So, yeah, proposing that investigation, that seems like a pretty firm line to draw.
It is a significant move, a clear signal of concern. If an investigation finds violations, the potential consequences could include suspending trade benefits under that agreement. But it's also crucial to remember, this is a process. It takes time. And it needs backing from other EU member states to really have teeth.
And it seems this didn't exactly get universal applause within the Dutch cabinet.
No. Reports suggest PVV members were surprised, maybe concerned, and apparently it wasn't discussed beforehand in the Council of Ministers.
Doesn't sound like perfect harmony.
It really highlights the internal tensions in the coalition on this issue. Bruinslot's later statement, emphasizing cabinet unity but admitting some ministers wanted earlier notice, feels like an attempt to smooth things over.
A lesson learned, she called it.
Right. But the underlying divisions are clearly still there.
Meanwhile, Geert Wilders was very active, very pro-Israel on social media during all this.
But notably absent from the actual parliamentary debate on it.
Which seems like a deliberate tactic, maybe?
It does. The PVV often signs up last for speaking slots in debates. That can limit chances for others to ask tough questions or rebut directly.
Okay.
And with Raymond de Roon being the main PVV speaker in the late-night Gaza debate, the party's stance probably got less public attention than if Wilders himself had been front and center.
Right. And despite all that, there's this growing call from other parties for stronger Dutch action beyond just an investigation.
Economic sanctions and arms embargo.
Yeah. The debate excerpts really show this push for something more decisive.
And what's revealing in those excerpts is that tension between wanting immediate, strong action and a more cautious diplomatic path.
Like Jan Paternotte comparing Gaza to a fire-needing action now, not just investigation.
Captures that urgency. Then you have Minister Bruinslot calling the letter a big step, but urging caution, emphasizing needing EU support, avoiding escalating rhetoric.
And Katy Perry calling the investigation may be a delaying tactic.
Yeah, questioning why another report is needed, given existing ones on alleged violations. It shows the frustration from those wanting faster, tougher action.
And Vanderberg's point about Europe's credibility.
Right, and supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
If there's perceived hypocrisy on human rights,
Hmm.
that broadens the whole discussion.
It really does. Highlights how interconnected these global political and ethical issues are.
Absolutely. Consistency on human rights is key for international credibility, for moral authority.
Okay, let's switch gears completely to the Binnen zonder Kloppen knock without entering segment. This focuses on the Dutch parliamentary inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic.
Ah, yes.
I have to admit, I was kind of surprised this inquiry is still going on.
That's understandable. With so much happening now, a long-term inquiry can fade from view.
Right.
But as the chair, Dan de Kort, explained, a parliamentary inquiry is the heaviest instrument the Dutch parliament has. It underscores its importance, the depth they're going for.
And they call their workspace a Corona bunker. Adds a bit of drama.
It does.
And while they couldn't say who'll be called to testify, confirming Henny Heisman, the TV guy, won't be, that was certainly unexpected.
A slightly random detail, yeah.
But the initial low number of members on the committee, dropping to just 4 after some left, that was a bit concerning, wasn't it?
It was. Being just one above the minimum, it raises questions about their capacity. Adding Gideon Van Meijeren from Forum for Democracy brings it back to 5.
But his past rhetoric, using words like tribunal instead of inquiry, that raises some eyebrows, right? About potential bias.
It does. That said, the chair seemed confident. He mentioned the agreed code of conduct, past experience working with members, hoping to mitigate those concerns.
And the sheer number of documents, over 8 million.
Staggering.
Enough to stretch from The Hague to Mexico City, apparently. Makes you wonder what's in all that paper.
It really shows the huge task they face. The chair confirmed they're using tech tools, researchers to review it all, essential for that volume.
Absolutely.
And while, listeners might hope for some dramatic smoking gun, the committee stated focus on learning lessons for future pandemics is maybe more realistic, ultimately maybe more valuable.
Probably true. And while the chair couldn't comment on specifics, like the cat shoes tapes, those government meeting recordings, he did stress the committee's extensive powers. They can compel testimony, even have the power of gieseling detention, though he said it's never been used.
Wow.
The anecdote about a background interview feeling like entering a courtroom, it really paints a picture of how formal and serious it is.
And the closed preliminary talks, trying to create a safe space for witnesses, with members getting interview training, it suggests a very deliberate, methodical approach, even if the setting feels intimidating.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus again, this time to international security, which is, well, pretty worrying. You were at a conference in Oslo recently.
I was, yes. It brought together 10 North European countries, the main topic, the security threat from Russia.
And it sounds like the discussions were quite concerning.
They were. Ukraine is obviously central, but there's significant growing concern about Russian military activity near Finland and Estonia's borders.
And those details you mentioned, new railways, headquarters, hospitals, airports built there.
And crucially, some military gear being built up that doesn't seem destined for Ukraine right now.
That's genuinely alarming. What's it for, then?
Exactly. That's the big question. Add to that Putin's goal of expanding the Russian army to 1.5 million.
Wow.
And their recruitment rate, 30 to 40,000 a month.
That's huge.
Compare that to the entire Dutch armed forces, around 70,000 total. It really puts Russia's expansion into perspective.
It certainly does. And the assessment from Skoof and Bruckelmans that Russia might be ready for another conflict just 2 years after Ukraine ends.
That raises serious concerns for NATO's eastern flank, especially the vulnerability of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, with relatively small forces.
So they're reliant on NATO allies.
Heavily, particularly the U.S., which introduces that layer of uncertainty, given the political situation there right now.
Right.
So these North European countries are trying hard to coordinate their own responses. It shows how seriously they view the threat.
And it's not just on land, is it? The North Sea situation sounds increasingly tense, too.
Very much so. More Russian fishing vessels suspected of mapping critical underwater infrastructure, data cables, gas pipelines.
And the fact that detailed maps of this stuff were recently just publicly available online.
Frankly shocking. Minister Breckelman's warning about this espionage is clear.
And there are key choke points in this infrastructure.
Yes. Strategic points where sabotage could severely impact the Netherlands.
And it's not just Russia. Mention of Chinese vessels doing similar mapping?
Yes, reports of that too. Plus China developing underwater cable cutting tech. It adds another dimension to the challenge.
So the upcoming NATO summit discussing European armament sounds crucial.
Very important, yes.
Okay, finally, let's look back at a past international incident, one that raises big questions about transparency. The 2015 Dutch F-16 bombing in Hawija, Iraq.
Ah, yes. The attack on what they thought was a car bomb factory.
But the secondary explosion was way bigger than expected, civilian casualties nearby. And it took ages for this info to come out. The Hawija bombing really reveals a potentially problematic culture in defense, maybe, where avoiding errors overshadows transparency about civilian harm.
What's deeply concerning is that delay. How could such a significant event with tragic civilian deaths stay hidden so long?
Exactly.
Minister Breckelman's explained it's not always instantly clear what the consequences of a strike are if civilians were present. Okay,
Hi.
but the policy revealed, marking no on evaluation forms for civilian casualties if no bodies were seen in the immediate images. Even with a huge explosion and damage suggesting otherwise, that's profoundly troubling.
It really is, especially since those images were reviewed back at the Ministry of Defense. It wasn't just the pilot's view.
Right. The explanation given was defense hesitated to report uncertainties, only confirmed info, which led to this long silence, this lack of transparency.
Seems insufficient somehow.
The suggestion that budget cuts might have fostered a defensive culture, fear of negative fallout from admitting errors, offers another possible reason, though maybe not a comforting one.
No.
The different views in the original discussion show the complexity here, balancing operational needs with the public's right to know.
Christine Tunison's point about the damage to the Netherlands' moral standing internationally when transparency lacks, that feels important.
It's a crucial point. And while Minister Breckelmans has apologized, offered to visit Hawija if possible, this incident is a stark reminder. Accountability, transparency in military operations. They remain vital.
Absolutely.
Learning from the past, even years later, is essential for upholding standards and maintaining public trust going forward.
Well, that was certainly a comprehensive deep dive, a lot of complex issues covered, so thank you for sticking with us. It really shows your commitment to staying informed.
A lot to take in.
It is. So instead of just saying thanks for listening, maybe think about this. In our increasingly complex world, how do we really strike that right balance between national security needs and the fundamental principles of transparency, of accountability, especially when dealing with the harsh realities of international conflict and military action?
No easy answers there.
Definitely not. It's a question that will keep shaping our political world. Now, before we wrap up, as promised, from the very end of our source material, a bit of fun, Eurovision predictions.
Ah, yes. Go on then.
Okay, I'll put it out there. Netherlands finish, 7th place. What do you think?
7th. Bold. I'll be slightly more optimistic. I'll say 5th place for the Netherlands.
5th? Okay, could happen.
And the Ajax versus PSV football championship race. Michael seemed pretty sure PSV will take the title.
He did sound confident.
I'm not arguing with that level of conviction.
Okay.
PSV it is.
All right, there you have it, our highly scientific predictions. If you want more of these in-depth analyses into the stories shaping things, make sure you subscribe. That was it for this time.